Thank you very much for those kind remarks. This book, Truman Capote, is the third oral biography that I've worked on. The first was called American Journey, The Life and Times of Robert F. Kennedy, an oral biography which involved interviewing the people who were on the funeral train from New York to Washington, along with some other people who were strongly identified with his life. The second one was called Edie, which was about a young girl named Edie Sedgwick, who was born of a very patrician New England family and had every advantage in life, very beautiful, quite talented in some ways, but sort of drifted down through the various interesting worlds of the 60s, Andy Warhol's factory, and eventually ended up out here in the motorcycle gangs of Buena Vista and died at that magical age of 28. This last one is about Truman Capote. He interested me because if you're going to do an oral biography, you ought to find somebody who is interesting in themselves and who has surrounded himself through his life with interesting people. Truman Capote was born in Alabama. Monroeville, Alabama was where he was brought up, a small town of only 1,600 people. Quite odd to think that his next door neighbor was Harper Lee of To Kill a Mockingbird. Quite astonishing to think that these two authors of high repute came from the same town. Not only that, but living next door to each other. Some people indeed think that Truman Capote had something to do with To Kill a Mockingbird. I rather doubt it. The styles are so entirely different. Towards the end of his life, Truman was very bitter about Harper Lee because she won the Pulitzer Prize for To Kill a Mockingbird. Truman Capote never won the Pulitzer Prize or the National Book Award for In Cold Blood. It was said that one of the judges thought it was too commercial a book. I thought what I would do is read little snatches of this book, this oral biography on Truman, little portraits of the man, and ones that I thought perhaps in reading would give you some sense of the style of this book and something about him. I've tried to describe this book a little bit as if you wandered into a cocktail party, a huge cocktail party, at which were invited all of Truman's friends and enemies. And that they were all arranged somehow chronologically, these groups, and that you would first talk or overhear people from Monroeville, Alabama talking, and then the people of his early life in New York when he was a copy boy for the New Yorker, then at Yaddo, where he went, the writers' colony near Saratoga, then perhaps to the Black and White Ball in the Plaza Hotel, and then in Holcomb, Kansas, where he went to do the research from In Cold Blood, then to meet the Swans, the high society folk that in whose houses he frequented, and then what happened when he turned against them in this rather strange, almost Aristotelian era, in which he felt that he could charm them with what he wrote, but indeed he did not, and then through the slow descent, Studio 54, and then finally Joanne Carson's house on Sunset Boulevard, where he died. This is Andreas Brown talking about him. Andreas Brown is the curator of the Gotham Book Mart in New York, one of the few last independent bookstores there. Andreas Brown, Capote's mother, Lily Mae Falk, was said to be a great Southern beauty, not in the sense that we consider great beauties today, but at that time she was considered a very attractive and charming woman. By all accounts, the prettiest girl thereabouts. Just an inch or so above 5 feet, dark blonde hair, barely 17, but today what we might refer to as a bubblehead. She certainly was irresponsible, childlike, a case of arrested development in the sense that she pursued adolescent values well into her 30s. She married the first fellow that came along who had any money, Arch Persons, and abandoned her son Truman to her relatives when he was about 2, just a baby really, and went off hoping to live the high life with her husband. She won a beauty contest sponsored by Lux, one of many, many regional winners. Capote expanded this, of course, into her winning the contest for Miss Alabama in the Miss America contest, a typical Capote exaggeration. Eventually, she divorced her husband, left her child in Monroeville, Alabama with the Falks, and went off to New York to seek fame and fortune. In Monroeville, she would visit her son very briefly, sometimes for a day, but she didn't stay very long. Monroeville, Alabama, was not her idea of glamour. This is Nancy Robinson, a young woman, a young girl in Monroeville, remembers this about Truman. One time I went with Truman next door to see Harper Lee. We played in the yard for a long time, climbing the chinaberry trees, and we got really hot and tired. We went into the house to a back bedroom where Nell's father had an office. There was an old typewriter on the desk in the room, and Nell grabbed some paper and put it in the typewriter. Truman started telling a story, and while he talked, Nell typed it. Well, they would not let me help with the story, so I grabbed my paper dolls and went home. This is Natalie Murray, who was an editor and a writer. He was hired as a messenger and an office boy for the art department in the New Yorker magazine. One of his duties was to sharpen pencils. He was bringing his pencils back to the studio when Harold Ross, the editor, encountered him. He turned around, looked at Truman, and asked, "What's that?" Truman, walking down the corridor with his pencil, looked like a little ballerina. He went then to Yaddo, the writers' colony near Saratoga. Carson McCullers was there at the time, Leo Lerman, who became a great editor, Mademoiselle. Here's Leo Lerman. We played murder a great deal. That game where the ace of spades is the murderer and the jack of hearts is the detective. And you mill around in the dark, hiding, and scared that the person next to you may turn out to be the murderer. One night at Murder, it was an extraordinary night, very full of clouds and a great moon. And we were all scared because we were playing in this great hulking mansion where we weren't supposed to be. I was the murderer. I knew exactly what victim I wanted. Truman. Everybody flew from room to room, screeching, hiding here, hiding there. Carson McCullers adored it. She gave screeches. We all screeched. She moved when she had to move. She wasn't sick in those days, slightly ossified, but she wasn't sick. We hid here and we hid there and conjectured about who the murderer was. Being the sinister creatures I enjoyed every minute of it. Finally, I lured Truman into my closet and I strangled him. He screamed, "Oh, I'll get you for this. I'll never trust you again." It was absolutely thrilling. His scream went up several octaves above and several octaves below. It was the full rage of Truman. It was the manly Truman, the female Truman. It was the works. I think the scream haunts Yaddo still. Truman, then of course Other Voices, Other Rooms came out, his first novel, with the famous picture of him on the back, lying on a sofa looking 12 years old. It was a picture he always said that he had not orchestrated, but in fact he had. The novel was a huge success. He went abroad for the first time. He spent a lot of time traveling, Truman. Here he is in Paris. This is by Carl Bissinger, who was a great photographer. Paris at that time was jammed with young Americans living there. They were everywhere that summer. Sometimes you wouldn't even hear French spoken in a restaurant. So that evening, after spending some time at a vernissage, we went to this little restaurant on the Rue Dragon to get as far away as we could from the constant chatter of American voices. Truman was in high spirits. He was everybody's darling, sporting that long bronzini scarf he wore, whatever the weather. He swept into the restaurant and we took the table in the back. Truman had begun telling stories, and telling them very well, when suddenly, from the front of the restaurant, some guy, a red-faced, very drunk American, called out something to the effect of, "For Christ's sake, wherever I go I hear that American faggoty pansy voice. Can't I ever get away from you guys?" He must have been kind of half-assed educated, because I remember him saying, "What the hell kind of Dorian Gray voice is that anyway?" The usual thing, then at least, was to ignore such people, but not Truman. He bristled and got up. He started shaking his finger at the man at the bar, shouting at him in that high, crazy voice, "Just you shut up. Wherever you go, you cause fights and trouble. Fights and trouble. Just you shut up. Don't wreck people's lives. Stop calling people faggots." On and on, this bantam rooster. What was interesting was that there was this general swell of approval from the French, quite solid. And though they probably had no idea what was being said, they supported Truman's performance. And you could tell, it worked. The guy hopped down off his stool and slunk out of the restaurant. Then Truman sat down and continued his story exactly where he had let off. No comment on what had happened. He just was not to be troubled by the Philistines. He had a marvelous sense of justice. I don't actually know whether it was a form of gay pride before there was such a thing, but it certainly was a form of courage and a demonstration of his own convictions. This is David Jackson, who was a poet, a great friend of James Merrill. And this is in Stonington, Connecticut. He had a blue T-shirt that kept riding up on his trunk, not tucked in his pants. The village had never seen anything like that, a bare midriff. The shopkeepers edged towards the door and peered out. His beach clothes had been designed for him by Schiaparelli. It was a sort of a faux baseball suit. He was very amusing that summer. We all adored him. If you had him for dinner, an evening of talk, he had these glasses he'd bring along, a clear pair, a slightly shaded pair, and a really dark pair. It was quite apparent that he couldn't lie properly unless his eyes were covered. So he would change glasses. When they were really dark, you knew a huge exaggeration, a lie was coming. We call them the shades of truth. The DuPonts have a house over there on Fisher's Island, and when they gave a lunch, they sent over this massive boat for Truman. He was very pleased with himself. When he came back, he said that there had been 100 for an outdoor lunch, medium-shaded glasses. There had been a young girl there in her teens, hundreds of gulls, it was the mating season, were circling around the dock. As lunch went on, this girl was dying to go down to the dock and look at the gulls. Everyone said, "No, don't. They're very vicious at this time of year." Darker glasses. Finally, she went with an umbrella to watch them. On the docks, the umbrella collapsed in the wind, and the gulls tried to peck her eyes out. Darkest, darkest shades. This is, I did this. This is, I tried to speak into a tape recorder and then, of course, did some editing to make it sound absolutely terrific. And this is about these women, these people he called his swans. He called them his swans for their beauty, their elegance, their charm. And not unsurprisingly, because they all seem to be endowed with long necks. Babe Paley, Morella Agnelli, Gloria Vanderbilt, Gloria Guinness, Cece Guest, Lee Radziwill, Slim Keith. Babe Paley was, to use a completely inappropriate term, the leader of the pack. Slim, elegant, a remarkable beauty. She was surely the most undisheveled person imaginable. So groomed, everything perfectly in place, whether she was sitting in a cabana on the Lido or hosting a fancy dinner. It would be difficult to imagine her being tossed about by a strong wind. She would remain as unruffled as the figurehead on the bow of a ship. Billy Baldwin, the society decorator, once said of Babe Paley, "So great is her beauty that no matter how often I see her, each time is the first time." This is still me. Babe Paley came into his life in the mid-50s. The story was that the David Selznick, invited down to the Paley's place in Round Hill, Jamaica by private plane, had asked if they could bring Truman along. The Paley said, absolutely, it would be our honor, thinking that the Selznicks were referring to Harry Truman. One can imagine the Paley's surprise, expecting the former president to walk through the door of the plane and getting instead a squeaky-voiced personage trailing a long scarf, his mischievous face under a wide-brimmed straw hat. But of course they all got along famously. I doubt it took more than a few minutes for Babe to be absolutely enchanted by him. This is Jan Cushing's. She was a great friend of his. The only time he ever tried to do something funny was when someone came in that I rather fancied at the time, and Truman said, "Let's make him jealous." He lunged over and gave me this gigantic French kiss. I said, "Truman, honestly," and moved away. He was joking. I met Truman at a dinner that Lester Pirsky was having at the Four Seasons. I was seated next to Truman. We started talking about psychiatrists. "Are you going to a psychiatrist?" Truman asked me. I said, "Yes." He asked me the psychiatrist's name, and Truman said, "Oh, I know him well. He's terrible. Let's play a trick on him." "Well, what type of trick?" I asked. "I'll set it up," he said. "When you go to the office tomorrow, you say to the doctor, 'I have finally found the man of my dreams. I don't need you anymore.' That's all you have to do. Do it about 11 o'clock. The next day I walked in and sat down and I said, "Doctor, I finally found everything you told me to look for in life. I've found the man of my dreams." The doctor said, "I'm so happy, Mrs. Cushing, that you have. I'm so happy that you've listened." At which point, in walks the nurse, dead white and ashen, and she says, "Doctor, Mrs. Cushing's fiancé has arrived." 2 seconds later, in walks Truman, outfitted with a cape, and he screams, "Darling, you snuck out of bed without waking me. I'm so unhappy. I miss you so." The doctor almost went into a faint. He dropped his pencil. Truman said, "Bye-bye, doctor," and he walked out with his arm around me. That was my first experience with Truman, and the last time I ever saw that psychiatrist. This is Slim Keith, one of the Swans. He called me up one day. "The New Yorker's giving me a choice of assignments." He said, "I can either follow a day lady around New York who never sees the people she works for and write portraits of them just by what I see, or I can go to Kansas where there have been some murders. Which one do you think I ought to do?" "Do the easy one," I said. "Go to Kansas." He took Harper Lee with him out to Kansas, where the Clutter murders had taken place. A family of 4 wiped out by 2 drifters, Perry Smith and Dick Hickox. Truman did not make a particularly good impression on some of the agents out there. This is why Harold Nye held it against him. Al Dewey invited me to come up and meet this gentleman who'd come to town to write a book. So the 4 of us, KBI agents, went up to his room that evening after we had dinner. And here he is in a kind of new pink negligee, silk with lace. And he's strutting around the floor, across the floor with his hands on his hips, telling us all about how he's going to write this book. Harper Lee was there. She had the room next to Truman. Absolutely fantastic lady. I really liked her very much. But I did not get a very good impression of that little son of a bitch. We go up there and he's parading around in his negligee. It was not a good impression. And that impression never changed. There's one thing I'll throw at you which will kind of give you the way I feel, the way I do. My wife is a very strict individual, always has been. She's as straight as an arrow. Usually, she went with me down to the Muhlenbach Hotel downtown where we had dinner and talked, okay? One time when he came, Truman asked if we wanted to go out and look at Kansas City, go out for the evening. Well, sure, you don't turn him down. So first we got a cab, and just off the main street, about a block and a half off 35th and City 6, we go up there and there's a discussion where he pays $100 to get us into a place above a gallery to watch what's going on in a lesbian bar. Now here was what it was. They were eating, tables, dancing, probably 100 people in there, female couples doing their thing. This was horrible to my wife. She tried to turn away from it, but she didn't dare say anything to Truman. We leave, and he takes us over to a male gay bar, and we go in there. We sit down at a little table and order a drink, and it isn't 3 minutes until some of these young bucks nail him, talking to him, playing with his ears, just right in front of my wife. But how the hell do you say anything to a man as famous as Truman Capote that you don't like what he's doing? This went on for a little bit, and we finally tried to excuse ourselves and leave. But Truman gets us to go on to the Jewel Box, a little theater. And there I expect there must have been 30 female impersonators in there. And they're damn good. I mean, they looked as good as any beautiful babes in New York. But at the end of their little skits, they revealed that they were males. Now, to take this lady, my wife, and Truman knew what kind of a lady she was because he had been to my house, and subject her to this. Well, his stock went down for us from 60% to about 10. Then Truman, of course, gave his famous black and white ball in New York in the Plaza Hotel. This is Katharine Graham, who he gave the ball for, who was then the new publisher of the Washington Post, a very shy woman. Her husband had committed suicide, and she was just taking over the reins of this huge empire. Something that was very hard for her to do. And indeed, her daughter told me not long ago that this ball had changed her from a rather shy, withdrawn person into someone of substance. And this is her recollection of how this all began. Truman called me up that summer and said, "I think you need cheering up, and I'm going to give you a ball." Well, I said, "I don't need cheering up, and what are you talking about?" I was totally baffled. He said, "Yes, I've always had this idea for a black and white ball." He told me that he'd always loved the black and white scene at the racetrack in My Fair Lady. Also, he said that he loved the ballroom in the plaza and always wanted to have a party there. I was still sort of baffled, but then he got rolling with it and the publicity got started. I felt a little bit that Truman was going to give the ball anyway, and that I was part of the props. Perhaps a prop is unfair, but I felt that he needed a guest of honor, and with a lot of imagination, he figured out me. This is Lewis Lapham, who went to the ball, and the editor of Harper's Magazine. I passed through the police barricades in front of the plaza and listened to Pete Hamill, among others, shouting at me that this is the beginning of the end, that the tumbrils will soon be rolling. He was then a New York Post reporter, and he was speaking for the sans-culottes, that this was all too brash and arrogant a display of wealth and celebrity, and it was being thrown in the teeth of the Democrats in the streets, and so forth. I remember the evening being extraordinary for one reason. At most New York parties, there's always a degree of anxiety. It was good to be there, but was one at the right table? Or was one being seen at the right end of the room, over the right people? But on this occasion, every table was the right table. Simply to be present was to be, for the time, safe, for the time being safe on the high and sunny plateau. So all the tables were equally fine, and everybody was just pleased to be present. Then I noticed this extraordinarily beautiful woman, whom I later found out was Luciana Pignatelli. She had some sort of a career as an Italian model, or was somehow associated with the Italian haute monde. Clearly she had that manner. I remember that she was wearing an immense jewel, an emerald, or a ruby, possibly a diamond, in the middle of her head. She wore a kind of head ribbon, and in the center of it was this great stone. I don't know whether it had come from India, or had once been worn by an elephant, or the Tsarina of Russia. But it was clearly a stone that had a history. Empires had perished. Many had died in order to provide this brilliance for the head of Luciana Pignatelli. I noticed that every time she moved or danced or glittered in the light, about 3 guys were standing around whose eyes never left her forehead. She had more security than any of the Kennedys present. Apparently, she had borrowed this jewel from Harry Winston, and Winston had let it out of his sight only on the condition that it was followed by 3 heavies with guns. At the end of the party, Johnny Agnelli wanted to go someplace and play poker. It was 2 in the morning. One of the places to play poker at that hour was Elaine's. Among the cognoscenti, or the friends of Gianni as they were known, someone had suggested, why don't we all go to Elaine's and play cards? Somehow I ended up in the same limousine with Luciana, who was part of his entourage. She was not wearing the jewel. The guards had removed this thing from her forehead. I may be exaggerating. Maybe she went tastefully into the ladies' room, put it into a portable safe and presented it to the guards that way. A lead-lined casket. In any case, the jewel did not get into the car. It didn't get out of the hotel, and it never graced Elaine's. This is a little poem that John Sargent wrote about the party. He found it in his diary. He was the publisher of Doubleday at one point. In my diary, I have this curious poem. I have no idea whose it is. It just sits there. Truman Capote is not nearly as dotty as some of the people who went to his party. This is a piece about Truman by Judy Green, the novelist, which I think tells you something about this, about Truman that is about as well said as anybody in the book, I think. One of the wonderful things about Truman was he always had the element of little boy wonder in him, and that's a delightful characteristic in someone. As jaded as his appetites were, his surprise and wonderment never ceased. If someone paid him a compliment, he was thrilled. It was as if it were for the first time. Of course, other times he'd say, I started this new kind of journalism, and I'm the greatest there ever was. But still, the little boy wonder was there. Imagine someone who was brought up in very shabby circumstances, suddenly coming into the rolling lawns of Long Island and being accepted where Gatsby never was. Truman didn't have the yachts, or the house across the Sound, or the looks, or the money. Yet people were crazy about him. To reach the apogee of acceptance with his black and white ball, well, he was more than just a darling, he was a social lion, an arbiter. If you weren't invited to Truman's ball and he didn't accept you, that was a black mark in society. And to reach that level, I mean, it's almost an insanity. It's a fluke. It's weird. Was he a product of the times? Would it have happened in Edwardian England? God, no. Who would ever dictate like that? He was foppier than any of them. I mean, Noel Coward couldn't have done it. Oscar Wilde, if he'd stayed out of trouble, couldn't have done it. There were writers who wanted it. F. Scott Fitzgerald wanted it at one time. John O'Hara was desperate. Truman used all of his physical disabilities as attributes. The voice, the body, the hand movements, the tongue. And then the metamorphosis took place, from prince to frog. The swollenness that took over his whole body that was grotesque. A still boyish face with that swollen, strange look. But I never knew him when he wasn't sweet to me. Odd. He said to me, you know, people have a look, and they have to keep it. And when you keep a look, you never grow old. The reason that he turned... Well, I'll read one more, then I'll tell you what happened. This is Richard Brooks, the director who made In Cold Blood, the film. When we arrived at Lawrence, Kansas, where the university is, I met Truman and asked him what he was doing there. He said, they put a stand out on the football field. The students are going to come and I'm going to talk to them. About what, I asked. I'm going to read some poetry and my Christmas story. You're going out to a football field and you're going to read poetry to these people at night, outside? Yes, why not, he asked. I turned to Tom Shaw, my assistant director, and I said, see if you can get a couple of police because I think they're going to lynch him. We went out there that night and there were about 15 goddamn thousand people. And to see this guy who wrote the book, who's 4'1" with blonde hair, and he's going to read poetry, they couldn't get any police. I said to Tom, why don't you get on one side of the stand and I'll stand on the other, and if they start coming for him, we can get him the hell out of there. Tom's a pretty rough-looking guy. Between the two of us, we were going to take care of Capote. So he starts to read this stuff, and what happens? Not only do they not walk out of the stadium onto the football field, but by the time he's finished, 15,000 people are cheering and roaring like he's a football player. It was the most amazing experience, and I realized then that this guy was a superstar. I really thought there was going to be violence. Not a chance. They loved him. They were going to carry him on their shoulders like a winning football coach. Well, Truman then wrote this, or published part of this novel that he was working on, which was called Answered Prayers. And in it, he told a lot of sort of secrets of the Swans about their peccadillos, and particularly their husbands. And it destroyed him in their eyes. And they threw him into Coventry. And they turned their backs on him. Slim Keith, Babe Paley, all those people I named earlier, with the one exception of Lee Radziwill, who stayed with him. And it was a dreadful time for him because I think he wanted more than anything else to be part of this world. He began to drink. He began to drink very heavily. He also moved into drugs and so forth. He came out here to California on occasion to do film scripts. And here he is. This is Dotson Rader, a writer who describes a meeting that he had with Peggy Lee, the great singer, who used to be known as Miss Standing Ovation. Truman was a great jazz buff, and Peggy Lee was one of his favorite singers. So I called up Peggy, who was a friend of mine, and I said, I'm here with Truman, and we'd love to take you to dinner. Are you free tomorrow? She said, yes, why don't you come round for a drink around 6? Typical LA, they eat like farmers. She sends her car for us. The house is in Bel Air, and it's got an enormous front door, one of these modern houses with a lot of glass and stone. There's some trouble getting the door unlocked, so we stand there for a while. Then we walked in, and there's the biggest living room I ever saw in my life, and the longest sofa. Typical Hollywood, 2-floor ceilings. Peggy Lee can press a button on a console by her, and the screen comes down. The projector turns on, that sort of thing. It's an enormous, dramatic, theatrical Hollywood kind of place. At one end is a solid line of glass sliding doors overlooking her gardens. Peggy is dressed in a very thin, white chiffon gown. Peggy hadn't been too well. She moved very slowly because she had her oxygen tent with her. Truman takes one look at her and goes, oh my God, I'm in the presence of an angel. He goes over to her. She doesn't move. He takes her hand and kisses one finger. She says, can I get you something to drink? And Truman says he wants a vodka. And I say, I'll have the same. She buzzes for a man to come to get us drinks. He looks sort of bewildered because she doesn't keep any liquor in the house. He brings us Perrier water. Now that irritates Truman. He wants a drink. Peggy says to him, well, Truman, can I show you the gardens? So he says, well, all right, show me the gardens, but then we've got to go. He really wants a drink. She goes over to the sliding glass doors and she can't get them open. So Truman says, let me help. So the two of them, Peggy, who isn't very steady, and this little guy, are tugging and kicking and pulling, trying to get these doors open. And we never did get them open. So then we go to Le Restaurant, which is one of the most pretentious restaurants in America. So it's very popular in Los Angeles. It has started to pour. It came down cats and dogs. Once at Le Restaurant, Truman and I order drinks, and Peggy orders a bottle of Evian water, for which I paid $50. It came in a silver champagne holder. We are trying to hold a conversation in a room which has a tin roof, so you feel like you're on the Western Front in World War I, and the Germans are machine gunning your lines. We can barely hear a thing. Truman and Peggy and I are shouting back and forth at each other, trying to make conversation. Suddenly Peggy says to Truman, do you believe in reincarnation? And Truman says, well, I don't know, do you? She says, oh yes, I've been reincarnated many times. In my other lives I've been a prostitute, a princess, an Abyssinian queen. And Truman sort of looks at her and says, well, how do you know all this? And she says, I can prove it. I remember being a prostitute in Jerusalem when Jesus was alive. Truman says, oh really, what else do you remember? Oh, she said, I remember the crucifixion very well. Truman says, oh? She says, yes. I'll never forget picking up the Jerusalem Times and seeing the headline, Jesus Christ crucified. At that point, she gets up to go to the bathroom. And Truman looks at me and says, she's totally bonkers. You've got to remember all this is shouted over the machine gunning going on. She comes back and they start talking about singers, and Truman asks when she got started. Then something happened I noticed a lot with Truman. He would meet someone, make fun of them, although they weren't aware of it, and then suddenly they would say something that would reveal a vulnerability, some heartache or pain. And suddenly, Truman's attitude would change. One of the reasons he got along with a lot of people was that they were open with him, rather than being combative. I think that's one of the reasons he became to hate the rich, because with the exception of his few closest friends like Babe, Paley, they were never open with him. They were never vulnerable around him. Unless he knew a vulnerability of yours, he never felt safe around you. Anyway, they were talking about singers in the 40s, and she started talking about her mother, who weighed 360 pounds, and used to beat her up, and used to beat up her father all the time, and her as well. When she was 11, her mother took a butcher knife and stabbed her in the stomach, and she said she still had the scar. She started singing when she was 14 or 15 at this radio station in Fargo, North Dakota. And I forgot who heard her, one of the band leaders, Jimmy or Tommy Dorsey, and they brought her to Chicago to perform at the Pump Room at the Ambassador East. She arrived a couple of days early with a girlfriend. They had very little money. She was scared of the town. They checked into a motel. She was so naive, she didn't realize that the flea bag they had checked into was a whorehouse. She said, All these painted girls going up and down all the time, and it never dawned on me that people did that sort of thing. When they showed up at the Ambassador East, Mr. Dorsey put them into a hotel room. And for a week, until she got her first paycheck, she and her girlfriend would stay up late, so that around 11 or 12 o'clock at night, when people had put their room service trays outside in the hall, they would go down the hall and collect buns and butter. They didn't know that you could use room service. This story touched Truman. He suddenly became very protective of her. His whole attitude changed, and he asked if she could sing something. Here we are in the restaurant where the bill ended up being $300, and Truman and Peggy Lee sat there another 30 or 40 minutes, totally oblivious to everyone around them, including me, singing songs, Bye Bye Blackbird, I'll Be Seeing You, and all these old standards. And all the way back in the car, they talked about music, and every once in a while, the two of them would start singing. It was a lovely evening. All right, just two more here. Truman spent his last days with Joanne Carson, who was one of the wives of Johnny Carson. They're all called Joanne. I think this was number 2. And this is a description that I remember from going there. Joanne Carson's house is set back on a steep slope with a very treacherous driveway just off Sunset Boulevard. A garden of roses out front with a small swimming pool under the overhanging branches of a eucalyptus tree. Joanne said the temperature of the pool was kept bathtub warm. Truman enjoyed sitting on the top step, slightly submerged, holding forth by the hour on summer days. Joanne took me through the house, one story, rambling, and with so much foliage backed up against the windows that it had a wonderful, wondrous twilight feeling about it, like walking along the floor of a rainforest. Quite romantic and cozy. To help with the lighting, every room had an array of votive candles on tables, on the flagging, usually in clusters, varied sizes like organ pipes. Joanne told me that when she and Truman had a party, it took a half hour moving through the rooms to get them all going. Joanne said she used the candles for parties when people came over, but Truman felt that they were their best guests, so they always had the candles lit when they were alone. This is again Truman and Joanne in the very last days before he died in this room in the back. We would go on these marvelous imaginary adventures. He'd call me up from New York and say, tomorrow we're going to Paris. And I would pick him up at the airport. We would come home. I would put my answer phone on and cancel anything I had for the next day. And when I woke up in the morning, he would bring in a tray with croissant and sugar cubes from the Ritz Hotel and little jars of marmalade from the Hotel Crillon, which of course he'd lifted. Then we'd take out books from the Rodin Museum, books from the Louvre, and we'd take a trip there. Now we're going to have lunch, he'd say. He'd pick a restaurant, and we'd have a French-style cuisine here to match. And so he would spend a whole day in Paris without moving. We did the same thing with China. We went to Spain, we went to Mexico, Italy, and England. For the China trip, he brought these little painted earthenware medicine jars. We'd have Chinese food. We'd sit by the fireplace on the floor to have dinner, and then we'd look at the maps of China. He'd say, today we're going to Shanghai, and here's what we're going to see. And we would look through the books he'd brought. I don't know how he did it. He spent months putting these things together before we'd go on a trip. China was very important to him. It was the only country he hadn't actually been to. Well, there you are. Well, you've been very patient. I thought we could have some questions if you'd like to have me answer anything. I can answer you about Truman or about anything else for that matter. Yes?
I'm sort of interested about this participatory journalism and how you came about this. Question 1. Question 2, who was the most difficult person to get participated? And what tricks did you use to get them to looking forward?
Well, the question is not about Truman, but about participatory journalism, which I'm supposed to have invented, but it's not so. I didn't invent it at all. I got enormously interested in a man named Paul Gallico when I began writing for Sports Illustrated. Paul Gallico was a sports writer, the most highly paid sports writer in the country. And he worked in the so-called golden age of sport. It was the time of Babe Ruth and Red Grange, and Jack Dempsey was the heavyweight champion of the world. And Paul Gallico felt that it was very important, if you were a sports writer, to try to find out about sports at the very highest level, that it wasn't fair to criticize somebody for striking out in the bottom of the ninth, bases-loaded World Series, unless you yourself had seen how devastating a Major League curveball is. And so Paul Gallico climbed down out of the press box, so to speak, and he set himself up a whole series of confrontations. He caught Herb Pennock's curveball. He was a great pitcher for the Yankees back then. He played tennis with Vinnie Richards, who was Bill Tilden's partner, or rival. He got into the ring with Jack Dempsey. Dempsey was a man who didn't particularly like to find other people in the ring with him. And so Gallico was only in there for about 32 seconds. He had very little to write about the next day. He couldn't remember very much. What else did he do? He went down the Olympic ski run at Garmisch overseas, which was quite a feat because he'd never been on skis before. And he wrote a book, rather predictably entitled Farewell to Sport. And he went on to write popular novels. He wrote The Poseidon Adventure. And in this book, there's this chapter called The Feel. And it's about these various adventures that he had. He said, partially in answer to what you asked, the second question, he said the most terrifying thing that happened to him, of all these participatory things, was quite odd. It was riding in the locomotive coming through Gary, Indiana at 60 miles an hour, going through all those switchbacks and in the railroad yards. And that terrified him oddly more than being in the ring with Jack Dempsey. In any case, I read this thing when I began working for Sports Illustrated, and I wondered if it wouldn't be possible to do the same sort of thing, but at greater depth. You know, to join a football team rather than just catching a punt. And so I went to the editors of Sports Illustrated, and they said, fine, it's been done before. It's playing out the daydreams that all American males seem to suffer. I think it was James Thurber who said that 95% of American men put themselves to sleep at night, striking out the batting order of the New York Yankees. I have no idea what women daydream about to put themselves to sleep. Perhaps we can confer later on. And they began to help me set these things up, and they involved playing quarterback with the Detroit Lions and pitching in an all-star game in the Yankee Stadium, and getting myself terribly beaten up by Archie Moore, who was the light heavyweight champion of the world. All of this to write books. And I've done many books on that particular subject. So that's the first part of the question. And the most terrifying thing to me, oddly, a little bit, I suppose, like Paul Gallico and the railroad switchings and so forth, the one that terrified me more than any of the other things that I did was playing with the New York Philharmonic. I played the triangle with the New York Philharmonic and some of the percussion instruments. And of course, the reason it was so terrifying was that in music, you cannot make a mistake. You know, sports is all predicated on the idea that somebody is going to make an error. You know, in fact, you can't have a sport without somebody making an error. But in music, if you make an error, you destroy a piece of art. And I destroyed a number of symphonies. Poor old Leonard Bernstein, he was the conductor at the time, and he couldn't fire me because I was, a documentary was being made of this stint with the New York Philharmonic. So I would destroy, let's say, Mahler's Fourth Symphony. And, but he was stuck with me. Nothing he could do about it for one terrifying month. Probably more terrifying for him than it was for me. Yes?
Was Truman Capote morbid? And did he ever have a long-term relationship with one person?
Truman Capote, the question was, what was Truman Capote's stature? I would guess he was a little bit taller than, maybe an inch taller than 5 feet, or maybe a little under that. Built like a sawed-off shotgun, as Norman Mailer used to say, and rather behaved like one every once in a while. He had a wonderful, very handsome face and a normal sort of body, but his legs were like a truck driver's legs, very powerful. He was very powerful. He hand wrestled Humphrey Bogart, for an example, on the set of To Beat the Devil and threw him to the floor. His voice was this, almost everybody in New York can imitate his voice, but I can't. It's high with a lisp. His tongue used to sort of loll out of his mouth a little bit. His voice was so high that, as Gore Vidal once pointed out, it could only be understood by dogs. He had a number of relationships, all with men. His first great love was a man called Newton Arvin, who was a professor at Smith College and was at Yaddo, and had a lot to do with the education of Truman, in a sense, taught him the Greeks and the classics. His long-term lover was a man called Jack Dunphy, who was an Irishman, an actor. He was married to Joan McCracken, who starred in Oklahoma, and stayed with him. The only stable thing in his life was probably Jack Dunphy. He left Jack Dunphy a number of times, usually to fall in love with middle-aged Irishmen with large families. One of the families was the O'Shea family, and I think one of the most touching parts of this book. It's the longest monologue in it. In fact, there's a whole chapter devoted to this young girl named Kate O'Shea, her name was, and when John O'Shea, her father, went off with Truman, it disrupted the family, as you might guess, and the family began to fall apart. And Kate, who was the youngest of the 5 children, called up Truman in New York and said, "I need your help." And he invited her to come to New York, and she stayed in his apartment for 2 years. In fact, longer than that. He took her around to the modeling agencies, and she was only 13 at the time. I took her around to Dick Avedon, who took pictures of her, an extraordinary portfolio, and tried to do the very best that he could to give some sort of to stabilize her life somewhat. Took her out to Hollywood and introduced to her all the people out there and tried to make an actress of her. Changed her name from O'Shea to Harrington. That was not done by him, but it was done by by Wilhelmina, one of the modeling agencies. And in this book, I tried to find her for a long time, and then one day she recognized me on the street and came up and said, "My name is Kate Harrington." And we went off, and I listened to her for about 3 hours, and her monologue is in this book, almost as she spoke it, about what it was like to spend this time with Truman in his house and keeping a journal, which she did. An astonishing portrait, sort of a Pygmalion attempt on his part to help her. Some of the love affairs that Truman had were disastrous. People who were drunk, lovers who were drunk, and he had a very unhappy time with all of them, really, except Jack Dunphy, who was his faithful lover. They lived in Sagaponack, Long Island, in separate houses. Dunphy trying very hard for a long time to stabilize his friend, but unable to do so at the end. Yeah?
It's apparent from Gerald Clark's biography of Capote that he worked extraordinarily hard on In Cold Blood to make the book extremely accurate, and it seems that he took great pleasure in the inability of the New Yorker fact-checkers to find anything the least bit inaccurate in the story. And I know he always insisted that it was nonfiction, but it also seems to be true that, if the Clark book is to be believed, that in the end, he compromised in a crucial way and inserted a false ending. That is to say, the scene with which the book concludes apparently did not occur and was a sort of fabrication. And I can't help thinking that this must also reflect the kind of problem that you must have faced in your work as a nonfiction writer. The desire to produce a sort of perfectly shaped, plotted thing out of life itself, which seldom is. And I was curious to know whether you have an opinion about this problem yourself and whether you learned anything about Capote's attitude toward it.
Well, that's a very good question. The question, of course, has to do with if you write nonfiction and you're covering a story, should you be allowed to embellish it and put on glasses of a darker shade? The temptation there, of course, if you write nonfiction, is enormous. I like to think that I don't do what you just described. There are ways of shaping a story and still tell the truth. The ending of In Cold... Truman used to say that everything in Cold Blood was accurate. I did an interview with him for the New York Times in which he talked about the nonfiction novel. And I asked him a question. I said, in your description of the long ride, which is what the two killers do after they commit the murders in Holcomb, Kansas, and they only got about, I forgot what the amount of money was out of it, but they got nothing. They committed the murders because one of them had heard in prison that Mr. Clutter kept $10,000 in a safe. And they went into this farmhouse and murdered the whole family, and then went on this long ride. And at one point, Truman writes about the car in which they were riding swerving to miss a dog. And it's a wonderful device because a chapter or so later, you come back to this dog swerving incident. And I asked him, I said, did a dog really swerve? I mean, you weren't there, Truman. And he said, one does not write the sort of honest non-fiction novel that I've been trying here and make errors of that sort. Dick Hickox, who was one of the murderers, had, according to Truman, an absolutely rat-trap mind and remembered everything. Perry Smith, the other murderer, couldn't remember anything. He was very interesting in his own right. But Hickox had this extraordinary mind, and Truman went and took the same ride with them. Not with them, but the same places that they had all been, so that he could check Hickox's against his... Also, Truman had this incredible memory. He never could remember whether it was 93% or 95%. He sort of forgot what percent he was able to remember from conversations. Now, that all given, I have talked to people about errors in Cold Blood. Harold Nye, who was the fellow that he took to the gay bars and so forth, told me that he did not get at all right an episode with a housekeeper in Las Vegas where the prisoners were picked up. The ending of In Cold Blood, I think I asked Truman about that. The ending of In Cold Blood has this Alvin Dewey goes back to see his grandfather's grave, and he runs into a young woman who would have been Nancy Clutter's classmate, and he talks to her, and he sees her running down this path, and her hair is flying, and he is reminded of Nancy Clutter, who would have been about the same age and would have looked about the same. Truman says that Alvin Dewey did go to look at his grandfather's grave, and that at another time he had talked to this girl. And so what he did was to combine these two. Now, if you're a purist, he's fiddled a little bit for dramatic effect. I don't think that happens very often in that book. Truman, of course, had to hope desperately that the people were hanged. What was he going to do with the book in case these two killers got a life imprisonment, languishing away? So I think that every writer fashions things or hope things will happen which will make it dramatic. But I suspect that he came awfully close to the truth in that book. But Truman, you know, used to lie terribly. I remember he told me once about another series of murders that he was going to write about, murders in the western part of Nebraska. There was a landowner who was trying to get rid of some people along the river bottom. And so one by one he began to extinguish them, murdering them. And Truman swore to me that this was all true. And he said that one of the murders that was thought up by the murderer was to put 2 rattlesnakes in the front of a car, and when the couple would come out of church on a Sunday in this little Nebraska town, they would step into the front seat. And that was the murder weapon with these 2 rattlesnakes. And I said, Truman, that doesn't make much sense to me. I mean, rattlesnakes, first of all, have got rattles. And secondly, their poison is hemotoxic, and it takes a long time to have it much effect. The next time I heard the story, the couple had suddenly increased in age. They were in their late 80s. They were teetering on the edge of death. Not only that, but the rattlesnakes had their rattles removed, and they were laced with amphetamines. So Truman would swear this was so, but this was at a stage where I think this was post In Cold Blood. So who knows?
But do you have to choose your stories so that they have a plot? You can't deal with any other stories as a nonfiction writer?
How do you mean deal with other stories?
If you're, for example, interested in a person, but the person's life or the portion of the person's life you can afford to talk about or can gain access to doesn't fit together.
Then you leave it out. I think there are always ways. I'm, for example, been sent out by the New. I'll tell you the story I'm working on at the moment. Some years, and you may know about this, the New Yorker is going to do a big California issue. And some years ago, about 12 years ago, I came out here to cover a story about a man. He was a Vietnam War veteran. He was a cook. And he decided that he was going to fly. And he picked a most curious conveyance to do this. It was a lawn chair, a deck chair, to which he was going to attach some 24 helium-filled weather balloons. And he was going to rise out of this backyard in Long Beach, California, and up to about 500 feet or so. And he had with him, he was going to take with him in the with his lawn chair thing, a pistol, air pistol, and he was going to pop these balloons, and this was going to regulate his altitude. And the great day came. I went actually to the garden where this happened in Long Beach. It's a place about half the size of this room with a bird bath at one end and an iron flamingo at the other. And these tethering ropes were struck, and this guy in the deck chair, Larry Walters his name is, went up to 500 feet, and he reached with this air pistol, and it fell between his knees to the ground. And he went up 16,900 feet in this deck chair. And he drifted into the air patterns of LAX. And when I went out there to see him, he managed, I said, I'd really like to write about this, an amazing story. Now, most people don't believe this is a story when I tell them. They just don't believe it. Fortunately, there are photographs and so forth. This guy in his deck chair, he came down about 23 miles from where he started. Came down in the backyard of a policeman who was sitting in his deck chair reading a copy of the Los Angeles Sunday Times. And now, when I saw him, I said I wanted to write about it, and he gave me these transcripts of pilots who had looked out the window at 16,000 feet and seen a guy drifting by in a deck chair. You know? And so I have all this. Well, unfortunately, after I got all this information, Larry Walters called me up one day in New York and said, you know, this is my story, and I'm very anxious to speak about it in aviation clubs and so forth. Please don't write it. And so I had to honor what he'd said. So I kept all this material for quite a long while until Tina Brown, who was the editor of the New Yorker. I was talking about this one day, and she said, I'm doing this California issue. Please write it for me. And so I then had to find Larry Walters. Didn't know how to do that. Of course, his telephone number I had for him had gone. And I met a man out here who has a nexus, whatever that extraordinary thing is, where you can find out anything on that thing, in the internet. And he sent me a copy of what he discovered, that Larry Walters had walked in to the Santa Ana Mountains and shot himself through the heart with a rifle a year ago. Now, this story, I have to think a lot about what you've just asked me. Fortunately, I have transcripts and so forth. I have a transcript of his girlfriend, his fiancée, trying to get him to come back down. You know, come back, she began shouting 50 feet above the ground. And I've got to go and see her, and I've got to see. But when you have a story that wonderful, you see, the temptation to fix it a little bit, to dramatize it, is always there. But, you know, particularly with the New Yorker, you have to stick to the facts. And I don't think that story has to be embellished very much, do you? Yes?
I've seen that story on the internet. Not quite with that complete version of it.
Well, on the internet, about 2 months ago, the people in New Zealand who were not aware that he's dead gave him a prize for being the foolhardiest person of the year, although this thing happened 12 years ago. Yeah. Yes?
The young lady that Truman Capote taught for 2 years, did he give up her father during that time?
The father, yes, the question was about John O'Shea. John O'Shea and Truman finally had a terrific row, and John O'Shea escaped, or escaped is the wrong word, but left with Truman's manuscript of answered prayers. So Truman has always said. And left and now lives in Florida. The last person I really hope to see to do this is O'Shea. He's a great sports enthusiast, and I thought maybe because I'd written Paper Lion and Open Net and The Bogeyman and various other sports books that he might like to talk to me. And Kate, his daughter, felt that their relationship had gotten much better and that this might happen. And then Kate disappeared.
But he was there during the same time Kate was?
Yes.
They were living there with...
Well, John O'Shea never came to the apartment when Kate was there. They lived in California together. They went on trips together. They were in Europe a lot on yachts and so forth. Yes.
Would you describe your editing process?
Of editing a oral biography?
Yeah, editing your tape, interviews.
Well, what you do is you interview all these people, and then you try to break the interviews down into categories. For example, everybody that talks about Monroeville, you put into a big folder. And then what you do, at least what I do, I have a pool table at home, and you take out these little sections and you tape them together. I used to call them pythons. Some of them are almost as long as this room. And then you clip and you move them around until you think they have a flow to them. It's not really writing as much as stitching, in a way. It's like putting a sort of mosaic together. And you have to hope that the thing has a sort of a movement to it, like reading a novel, really. I think one of the pleasures of doing this, I'll give an example. I read a long piece about Frank Sinatra the other day in the New Yorker by John Lair. And he went to a lot of the LAR, I guess it is. I kept thinking, my goodness, he must have gotten all this information on tape. And how wonderful it would be to listen to these raw transcripts of what he, when he was talking to Sinatra's music people. And I think that's the one advantage of the oral biographies, is you get the raw transcripts, and if you know how to put those into an order, it's really like, as I was saying, it's like going to a cocktail party and overhearing people talking. There are disadvantages in that you can't lead the reader if you use this sort of method. You have to put 6 views of one thing, focused. It's a little bit like The Gates of Rashomon, if any of you remember that film, in which you have 5, I've forgotten how many, or 8, I guess it was, views of a particular incident that takes place in the gates of Rashomon. So it's a bit hard to tell the truth, really, because you have all these divergent views. And I think you have to let the chips fall where they may. I was very tempted to leave out Harold Nye. Harold Nye, for example, says that Truman, at the hanging, fled when Perry Smith was hanged. His friend, he'd become almost, in fact, Harold Nye goes to say that they had a love affair in the prison. Charles McAdee, who was the head of the prison, was absolutely furious at this. No way that they could have had a love affair in the prison. And said that, and actually described to me the octagonal shape of the death row in the Kansas City penitentiary. And that there was opposite Perry Smith was a terrible man called Andrews who hated him, who would have seen this and shouted and yelled. So, do you leave out Nye? Because you know probably that Perry Smith and Truman did not have a physical relationship in the prison, or do you let it sit? And it's a very difficult moral judgment that one has to make. My answer to all this was to let it sit. Makes it more exciting. Yes?
I was wondering, as you go through the process of putting the work like this together and then looking back and hindsight, how do you view yourself? Do you see yourself as a biographer? Do you see yourself as a reporter, as a story catcher?
Well, I never really thought about that. I suppose I would consider myself an oral biographer. A terrible phrase, oral biography. Norman Mailer said it sounded like infectious disease. But, I don't know. I suppose I would consider myself a stitcher of other people's transcripts. Couple more? Yeah.
How do you think Truman wrote that second manuscript that put him on the outs with all the social...
That's a very interesting question. The question was, why did Truman write this amazing story which appeared in Cote Basque, in Esquire magazine? It was called Cote Basque. Scene in a restaurant, and one of the people, the protagonist of the story, talks about the people sitting around in this fancy New York restaurant and about the people coming in and out. And One of the stories, for an example, was about Anne Woodward, who committed suicide right about that time, and some people think she was so upset by what she read in Truman's thing that she threw herself out of a window. That was the story. She was the wife of Bob Woodward, William Woodward, and she shot him with a shotgun, you remember, in Long Island, mistaking him for a burglar. And it almost was almost pretty much. And Truman, it's interesting, she had in Europe, Truman had overheard her calling him a fag. And he went like this at her. And this may have been his reason for putting this story in the Côte Basque. There's another story in there about Babe Paley's husband, the most vivid thing. You had to guess who these people were, but it was pretty areas in the St. Regis Hotel, trying to do away with the evidence of a liaison with a mistress. And people could guess who the mistress was, too. Mary Rockefeller, very likely, wife of the governor. This thing came out, and it caused an unbelievable stir, as you can imagine. And it was when they all turned against him. Now, why did he do this? Well, some people felt, Truman himself felt, that they would be amused by all of this. He was a writer. What else did they expect? Andreas Brown has an interesting idea. Truman's mother was in love with the idea of becoming a member of high society. And she married Joe Capote, and that's why Truman's name is Capote and not Persons. Changed her son's name when he was 2 or 3. She drove Mr. Capote, he was really quite a successful businessman, into spending so much for an apartment on Park Avenue and the so high life that he had to eventually embezzle money from his firm.